Fog hung low over the ridgeline, soft as breath. That morning, Laura stood barefoot on the porch of her tiny cabin, the kind of place where silence isn't empty. It's alive. Once a high-powered attorney tangled in deadlines and depositions, she'd walked away from that life, swapped skyscrapers for treetops, traded courtrooms for birdsong. She had no grand plan, just a camera, a second-hand truck, and a deep, aching need for something real. Nature had become her quiet religion, each trail a kind of prayer. And then one day it happened. At the edge of her property, barely visible through the trees, was a bobcat. Wild, shy, watching. It wasn't the kind of animal you expected to hang around humans. But there it was, day after day, just a little closer. As the first frost crept in, Laura left out a scrap of food. Small, careful, respectful. She didn't think of it as a rescue, not yet. It was just the beginning of something she didn't fully understand. And like every good story, it didn't knock on the door. It waited, quietly. Trust doesn't arrive like thunder. It shows up slowly, like fog lifting, or a heartbeat settling after fear. That's how it was with the bobcat. She never gave him a name. That would have felt intrusive. He wasn't a pet. He was an animal of the wild, still holding on to his instincts like a lifeline. But there was something in the way he looked at her. Like he remembered a world before hunger, before cold. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't see a human. Maybe he saw something gentler. Laura kept the offerings minimal, a scrap of cooked meat here, a shallow bowl of water there, always left after dusk, always retrieved before dawn. She didn't linger or talk to him. She didn't even try to snap a photo, even though her fingers itched every time she caught a glimpse of him slinking between shadows. This wasn't about capturing a moment. It was about honoring it. Still, the presence of this silent guest stirred something deep in her, a hum she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't excitement, it was reverence. Worried that her kindness might backfire, she reached out to a local wildlife biologist, a no-nonsense woman named Grace, who answered the phone with a tone like she'd already heard your question 100 times. "You feeding him?" Grace asked bluntly. Laura hesitated. "I mean, just barely. I'm not trying to tame him or anything." "That's good. Just don't teach him to expect anything from people. That's when it gets dangerous. For both of you." Laura took the advice seriously. She started spacing out the food, reduced the quantity, kept her scent off everything. Every step, every action was guided by one rule. Don't interfere with his wildness. You're not the hero of this story. You're just a quiet witness. Over the next few weeks, the bobcat returned again and again, no longer slinking but walking, head low, tail still, cautious but calm. Once Laura saw him pause at the edge of the tree line and just sit there, looking toward the cow house, not moving, not blinking, as if listening for something. By now, snow had kissed the mountain tops and the nights dropped well below freezing. The forest grew quieter, its rhythm slowing to a crawl. Still, he came, alone, always alone. There was one night, mid-December, when Laura sat inside reading by lantern light. A strange calm had fallen outside, too quiet. She stepped out, not expecting anything, just stretching her legs. And there he was, closer than ever before. He didn't flinch, didn't growl, just looked at her, eyes like dusk itself. And she did the only thing she could, nothing. She stood there, heart thudding, arms loose at her sides, trying not to cry from the sheer weight of the moment. She didn't know then what it meant. But later, she'd remember that night as a turning point. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. There was no movement, no contact, no sound. Just a shared stillness. It was almost enough to believe the forest had accepted her, if only for a breath. Of course, nature never stops moving, and neither do the ones who survive it. One morning, after a particularly brutal storm, she opened the door and saw something she never expected. Not just the bobcat, but something smaller, lying beside him. The storm had been unforgiving. Ice clung to the trees like claws, and the wind howled with a kind of ancient anger. Laura hadn't slept much that night. The roof groaned, the windows rattled, even the mountains felt restless. By morning, the landscape looked like it had been dipped in silver and silence. Her cabin, though safe, stood like a fragile outpost in the great frozen wild. She wrapped herself in a thick wool sweater, cradled a cup of black coffee, and opened the door. That's when she saw him again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Lying just behind the bobcat was a much smaller figure, barely moving. A kitten. Tiny, wild, and clearly injured. Its fur was matted with snow and dirt, and its breathing was shallow, like every inhale was a decision it had to make. Laura froze. Her brain scrambled to make sense of the image. Was this his cub? No, her cub. This bobcat was female. The signs were all there, now that she saw them. And here she was, this fierce, elusive animal, bringing her injured child to a human doorstep. It didn't make sense, but it was happening. Something cracked open inside Laura. Not panic, not even fear. Something more primal than either. Purpose. The mother bobcat didn't run when Laura stepped out. She just watched. Eyes steady, body still. Not aggressive, but not begging either. It was more like an offering or a test. Laura lowered herself to her knees slowly, arms extended just enough to show she meant no harm. She whispered without thinking, "I won't hurt him, I promise." She crawled forward inch by inch, and when she reached the kitten, it barely stirred. That worried her more than if it had hissed or clawed. She gently wrapped it in an old flannel towel, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. And still, the mother bobcat stayed. She didn't follow Laura as she backed away, didn't growl or pace, just stood there, watching, trusting. By the time Laura was inside, she was shaking, not from the cold, but from the weight of what had just happened. This wasn't just a rescue. This was a story that defied everything she thought she knew about wild animals and boundaries. She didn't hesitate. She called Grace, the biologist, who picked up, with the same dry tone as always. "I have a bobcat kitten," Laura said, skipping the greeting. "Injured. The mother brought it to me. I think she wants help." There was silence on the other end. "Say that again," Grace finally said. Laura repeated it, slower this time. "Well, damn," Grace muttered. "That's unheard of." By the time Laura got off the phone, she already had a plan in motion. A wildlife rehab center existed nearly 4 hours away. Underfunded, understaffed, but reputable. She packed a crate with blankets and placed the tiny animal inside, whispering to him as she drove. "Hang in there, little one. Just a bit longer." Outside the frosted windows, the world passed in slow motion. Trees blurred into shadows. Snow flurries danced across the windshield. And all she could think was how strange and strangely beautiful it all was. That a wild animal had crossed a line written in centuries of instinct and asked her, a human, for help. She didn't know if the kitten would survive. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let him go without a fight. The drive to the rehab center felt like a strange kind of pilgrimage. 4 hours of winding roads, white silence, and a fragile life tucked in a crate on the passenger seat. Laura checked on the kitten constantly, whispering little reassurances as if the sound of her voice could stitch his breath back together. At one point, she reached over gently and touched the towel he was wrapped in. It was warm, barely, but it was something. By the time she pulled into the gravel driveway of the wildlife center, her hands were numb, not from the cold, but from holding so much fear without letting it spill. The building was modest, a weathered structure surrounded by fences with the smell of pine and antiseptic in the air. A faded sign read, Mountain Haven Wildlife Rescue. Inside, the staff moved quickly but with calm. They didn't ask unnecessary questions. One glance at the kitten, and they were already in motion. "He's young," said a vet named Julie, brushing a streak of dirt from his fur. 6, maybe 7 weeks, dehydrated, multiple lacerations, one paw's infected. Lucky you brought him when you did. Lucky. The word hit differently. Laura thought of the Bobcat mother, how she hadn't flinched as her kitten was taken away. That wasn't luck. That was a choice. A wild, impossible, heartbreaking choice. Laura stayed at the center for several hours. She paced, sat, paced again. Eventually, Julie returned, with updates. "He's stable. We've got antibiotics started, fluids going in. We'll monitor the paw, see how it responds before deciding on surgery." Laura exhaled. Only then did she realize how tightly she'd been holding her breath. Over the next few weeks, Laura made the drive again and again, sometimes with supplies, sometimes just to see him. The staff had started calling him Coda, a name meaning friend. It stuck. Coda responded slowly to treatment. His tiny body fought hard. There were setbacks, a low-grade fever, a refusal to eat, a small seizure that almost sent him back to the edge. But with every obstacle, Coda clawed his way back. He had that same quiet defiance his mother had, that same stillness, like he was part of the forest even while lying on a metal table under fluorescent lights. Laura had imagined that once Coda was healed, he'd return to the wild. That had been the plan, the goal. But the closer they got to recovery, the more complicated that dream became. "He's adapting too well to humans," Julie told her one afternoon. "He's imprinting. He was so young when we started treatment, too young to remember fear." Laura knew what that meant. In the wild, Coda would approach people. He wouldn't know better. And that kind of trust could get him killed. There was no easy way to hear it. No comforting way to say it. Coda couldn't go home. At first, Laura tried to accept it like a fact on paper. Clinical, practical. But it hurt in a way she hadn't expected. Not because it was inconvenient. Not because it meant change. But because it echoed something deeper. She thought of the Bobcat mother again, the way she had looked at her, the stillness, the surrender. That moment had carried a silent promise. Take care of him. Do what I can't. Now, Laura realized the promise was more than temporary, and she was about to make it permanent. Building a sanctuary for a wild animal wasn't part of Laura's life plan. But then again, neither was leaving behind a high-paying law career, nor falling in love with a solitary bobcat who stared through trees like she could see straight into your soul. Life had stopped following plans a long time ago. Once it became clear that Coda couldn't be released, Laura didn't hesitate. She began the long, bureaucratic dance of permits, inspections, and certifications. The paperwork alone could drown a lesser soul, but she approached it with quiet determination. Not because it was easy, but because it mattered. And somehow along the way, the process became part of the healing too. The enclosure had to be more than just a cage. That was non-negotiable. It had to feel like home, not a prison. So she cleared a space near the edge of her property, where the forest pressed closest. With the help of wildlife specialists, she designed a habitat that blended into the landscape. Fallen logs for climbing, shaded dens for rest, open patches where sunlight poured in like gold. Everything was built to mimic the rhythms of the wild. Coda watched much of the construction from a temporary holding area, his golden eyes tracking every movement, every sound. He was growing quickly, no longer the trembling creature Laura had first wrapped in a towel. His gait was strong now, his fur thick and healthy, but his spirit, it had changed too. He wasn't wild in the way his mother had been, but he wasn't tame either. He existed somewhere in between. Laura could relate. After weeks of labor, inspections, and more phone calls than she could count, the enclosure was finally approved. Coda was moved in just before dusk, the sky bleeding purple as he took his first steps into the space that would now be his forever. At first, he circled slowly, sniffing everything, ears twitching. Then, with no warning, he leapt onto a high rock and let out a soft, rasping chirp, a sound Laura had never heard from him before. It wasn't quite a meow, it wasn't quite a growl, it was something uniquely his. She smiled through tears, and that's when she saw her again. At the edge of the forest, half shadowed by fir branches, the mother bobcat stood, still, watching. Laura didn't move. Coda didn't seem to notice her, but the mother did. Her gaze was steady, not anxious, not aggressive, just present, as if she'd come to see for herself whether the choice she had made that snowy morning had been the right one. Laura whispered, almost to herself, "He's safe now." Over the next few days, the mother bobcat returned. Never too close. Never interacting. But she appeared at twilight, sometimes at dawn. Always silent. Always watching. And Coda, for reasons Laura couldn't explain, often wandered toward the far side of the enclosure when she did. He'd sit there, facing the trees, still as stone. Animal behaviorists might chalk it up to instinct, recognition, or coincidence. Laura didn't care much for textbook explanations. Some stories couldn't be explained. They could only be witnessed. As Coda adjusted to his new home, Laura made her own adjustments too. Her photography shifted. Less focus on landscapes, more on eyes, animal eyes, full of unknowable things. She started documenting Coda's journey, not for social media or attention, but to educate, to honor the animal who had trusted her enough to let her stay. One day she printed out a photo. Coda perched on the rock, silhouetted by mist. She framed it and placed it on the wall inside her cabin. Below it, a single word handwritten in soft pencil: rescue. In the soft hush of early evening, nature seemed to pause as if holding its breath. Laura stood quietly by the enclosure, the fading light casting long shadows across the forest floor. It was a moment suspended between worlds, the wild and the cared for, where two lives intertwined in a silent conversation beyond words. On the other side of the mesh, the mother bobcat appeared once more, her gaze locked with Coda's, who sat still, eyes reflecting the dimming sky. Neither moved, yet the air between them vibrated with unspoken understanding. This was not a reunion of the ordinary kind, but a bridge formed by trust, sacrifice, and a profound bond that defied human logic. Coda, no longer a frightened kitten, but forever changed by his rescue, carried the delicate balance of two lives, his own survival intertwined with his mother's quiet watchfulness. Laura witnessed their connection, sensing the invisible thread that held them together despite the barriers. It was a reminder that even in altered destinies, nature's heart beat strong. Through this journey, Laura's view of the wilderness had transformed. The rescue was not merely about saving a life, it was about embracing responsibility, compassion, and the fragile relationship between humans and animals. Her camera, once a tool for capturing beauty, became an instrument of advocacy, a call to honor the wild in all its complexity. As night deepened, Laura whispered a promise to the forest: to protect, to respect, and to share these stories that speak beyond words. The bobcat's story, quietly unfolding in her backyard, was a testament to hope, imperfect, real, and enduring. And so life continued, not as it was planned, but as it was meant to be, with its mysteries, its challenges, and the quiet miracles that happen when trust is given and received. Sometimes nature doesn't roar, it whispers, and those who listen, they're never the same again. Laura's story with the bobcat isn't just about an animal or even a rescue. It's about quiet trust and unspoken bond. And what happens when a wild heart dares to reach out and someone actually reaches back? Think about it. If a wild animal came to you for help, would you recognize the plea? Would you know what to do? Or have we been so caught up in our noise-filled lives that we've forgotten how to truly listen? If this story moved you, if it made you pause or look at wildlife through a new lens, then trust me, there's so much more waiting here for you. We've shared other stories that will shake you just as deeply, like the one where a bear returns to the exact spot it was rescued years later, or the lioness who risked everything to protect the one human who saved her cubs. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and stick around, because the wild still has so much to teach us, and we're just getting started.